Hello, thanks for joining us. We're here from Union Visual Effects, and we're going to talk about our work on 28 years later. Union's a relatively small company based in London, and we also have an office in Montreal. It's a great place to work. We do some amazing projects, ranging from invisible effects through to full CG space battles. We have a strong creative relationship with some great directors, including Martin McDonagh, Sam Mendes, Yorgos Lanthimos, and Danny Boyle, who we've been working with since Union opened in 2008. So 28 years later and The Bone Temple were filmed back-to-back. There was lots of overlap in the post schedules. Although a lot of our crew at Union was shared across both shows, they did have different core teams, as you can see. 28 years later was headed up by Adam Gascoigne, who has worked closely with Danny Boyle for over 15 years. I was DFX supervisor on 28 years later, and Noel supervised all aspects of the CG. So I'm sure everyone's familiar with the original 28 Days Later film from 2002. The writer Alex Garland and director Danny Boyle and the cinematographer Anthony Dodd-Mantle, who worked together on that film, reunited to make 28 Years Later. The original film also starred a relatively unknown Cillian Murphy, who was tipped to reprise his role of Jim in the new movies. Contrary to certain public opinion, this isn't him.
So next up is our 28 Years Later showreel. And just to warn you, in case you've not seen the film, there are some gruesome moments. We're going to take a deeper dive into some of the sequences and challenges we faced.
There's no discharge in the war. 7, 6, 11, 5, 9 and 20 miles today, 4, 11, 17, 32 the day before. Move, moving up and down again. There's no discharge in the war. Don't look at what's in front of you. Moving up and down again. Men go mad with watching them. There's no discharge in the war. Count the bullets in the bandolier. If your eyes drop, they will get the top of you. Moving up and down again. There's no discharge in the war. Moving up and down again. There's no discharge in the war. No. Look at what's in front of you. Moving up and down again. Men go mad with watching them. There's no discharge in the war. Count the bullets in the bandolier. If your eyes stop, they will get the top of you. Moving up and down again. There's no discharge in the war. You can tell when specified this is not fire, devil, dark, or anything but boom.
Right, so this was a really big project for Union with 142 artists working across the show. The edit remained in flux throughout the project with 194 omitted shots. As you can see, we were very close to 1,000 shots. Danny Boyle often likes to shoot his shows with multiple cameras and formats, so it's not unusual for us to work with a mix of cameras, but it was unusual in the choice of the iPhone 15 Pro Max as the main shoot camera. This approach in some ways both acknowledged and built on the camera choices made for 28 Days Later, which was shot on DV cam. Just to be clear, you can see that this is not how the majority of iPhone users film with their phones. The iPhone offered the camera team the opportunity to shoot with multiple cameras while also providing more maneuverability and flexibility. Shooting with the iPhone did bring some challenges for VFX. The cinematographer and his team created lens adapters that made it possible to add cinema quality prime, anamorphic, spherical and zoom lenses to the setup. We even had one shot where a telescope was attached to the front of the iPhone. Prior to the shoot, we identified several technical limitations affecting camera solving, which were fed back to the camera team. The main problem areas were tap focus. This caused significant distortion changes with small focus shifts. Pinch zoom, this resulted in unreliable on-set camera focal length data, which increased the reliance on survey data and tracking software to solve the lenses. Digital stabilization and internal sensor stabilization, this severely reduced usable parallax on some of our plates, making accurate camera solving very difficult. And lens solving was another issue due to the amount the external anamorphic lenses added. This meant we had to create a lot of custom lens distortion models to solve certain shots.
So we did a lot of testing of the iPhones before principal photography started, and these were some of the 2D challenges that we found working with the footage. So the main challenge was the lower quality blue channel, which meant it wasn't great for keying, particularly with blue screens. The sensor also appeared to struggle with high saturation blue light. There were distinctive noise artifacts that required bespoke iPhone digital noise gizmo creation in Nuke. There was a lack of dynamic range with highlights clipping at much lower values than we're used to, and some shots looking a little flatter than with our other cameras. Having said all that, once we'd done all our testing, we were able to create various setups and templates that helped to mitigate and reduce some of these issues, and the iPhone footage was actually quite robust most of the time.
Here we have the bar cam rig. This setup would have 8 to 15 iPhones mounted on a custom rig to create a bullet time effect. Our approach for this setup was to create a master lineup frame from one iPhone and then match all the other iPhones to it. Each phone required a unique distortion profile, as minor variations in the focus distance across the rig required unique calibrations per camera. Here we have some examples of the bar cam in action.
So there are three. There are three types of infected in 28 Years Later: the slow-low, the regular infected, and the alpha or berserker. Oh, sorry, here we are. Killing each had its own VFX requirements and workflows. So the slow-low is a slow-moving bottom feeder, quietly creeping around and feeding on worms and bugs. And they'll sort of creep up on you and bite. They have very high blood pressure, unsurprisingly, given their appearance. So an arrow hit in the right spot will create a dramatic spray of blood. We achieved this with animated CG arrows, tracked in with roto-anim, and a combination of 2D and FX blood. And there's a substantial amount of bespoke work on each of the slow-low kill shots, but they actually only appear a few times in the movie, so it was quite manageable. There are lots of kills for the standard infected, so we needed a scalable, efficient approach. So for the arrow firing, the actors would draw the safety arrow and then drop them on the ground before release. We generally took a 2D approach then, prepping out the dropped arrow and animating on a still frame. We used 2D blood elements combined with practical onset squib hits for impact. There were some difficult angles that required CG arrows, but we managed to avoid FX blood and kept to quite an efficient 2D oriented approach. So the rage virus has a steroid-like effect on the alphas. They're hard to kill and required a correspondingly large amount of visual effects work. For the nighttime chase alpha, we had multiple CG arrows requiring roto-anim and the full CG flaming bolt. The alpha was filmed wearing a body harness for this scene, which had to be prepped out with an almost full body rebuild for some of the angles.
We're now going to have a look at one of the main VFX creative challenges for the show, which was creating the causeway environment. Our story starts in a community that has managed to protect itself from the rage virus, Holy Island off the coast of Northumbria. This is a real place, connected to the coast via a 1 mile long tidal causeway. The real Holy Island was used for the village sequences, which did not need a great deal of VFX augmentation, just some cleanup of modern elements. The perimeter gate is a fortified gateway where the island meets the causeway. This was filmed on location at OC Island in Essex. On-set reference was captured at both locations to aid in the CG build of the environment. Additionally, at the midpoint of the causeway, there is a ghost gate. From a story point, this acts as a visual guide to aid with when crossing and the tide is high. The beach where the causeway meets the mainland was shot near Colwyn Forest in Scotland. So these three places with their unique topography had to be pulled together into one coherent space. Much of our VFX work was connected to augmenting and rebuilding wide establishing shots of the island and a series of different views and sequences crossing back and forth on the causeway. The causeway is a key story point. We extended it to 1.5 miles long and made it straight and much deeper on either sides. A great deal of work went into planning and building this asset, and there were many challenges associated with creating an environment of this scale. This was a huge asset. We created specific builds to help with switching between wide and close-up shots. We worked in a procedural way in Houdini using height fields and curvature attributes to provide flexibility for updates and consistency for scattering objects such as rocks, boulders, seaweed and gravel. This approach allowed us to quickly address notes to change the shape and the width of the causeway without a big impact on the overall look of the causeway. We used Solaris and Houdini and variants to be able to switch the level of detail for the scatter objects. And alongside this, we also created lighter proxy assets for the other CG departments to use. The on-set team also captured tidal reference at OC and Holy Islands, which was used to inform the effects for the variations in scale, frequencies and movements of the water at high and low tides. Here are some before and afters showing the different angles from the causeway. The causeway was also a challenge for the lighting team. We are first introduced to the causeway in the daytime. We had a lot of on-set reference to aid with lighting the causeway, such as time-lapse photography from OC and Holy Island. We also had drone footage, which was a great visual guide as we were replacing large parts of the shot with our CG causeway environment. This allowed us to match wave patterns and lighting hotspots in effects and lighting. Other lighting tasks include enhancing the danger element of crossing the causeway by experimenting with the water shader depth properties, animating light to match time-lapse references, and the FX team also had the job of simulating rising water levels and wave frequency changes when moving water over shallow submerged areas. The nighttime causeway chase scene was shot in a large, shallow tank in a studio. For the final composition, the lighting was heavily influenced by the DMP night skies, which included nebula and auroras. The lighting workflow involves matching the practical studio lighting first and then adding sky reflections in the render passes. Rendered layers that we created included mists, effects water, sea extensions, and interactive white water.
So working with water in the confined space of the studio, as you can imagine, meant that the reflections of the studio lights were baked into the water and splashes, and were not always coming from the right direction to work in the sequence. So we chose to shoot the sequence on grey screens instead of blue or green screens, which gave us good edge results, more control and better lighting on set, as well as fewer challenges with spill. Having done our iPhone camera tests early, we were also keen to avoid large amounts of keying on the iPhone footage. So we wanted to keep the water interaction from the plate, from the photography, particularly when close to camera, as cleaning it up and recreating it with effects would have been a lot more involved. We did have to use an effects approach for some shots, but doing it across the whole sequence wouldn't have been very practical. So the sequence involved a lot of skilled prep and compositing work to paint out the background and the water tank edges. This was then supplemented with some effects trails of interactive water and splashes where needed, just to rebuild areas where the studio light reflections were too strong. So the result is a blend between the CG water and the plate photography, with a lot of complex and bespoke work in each of these shots. So for this sequence, there was a considerable collaboration with the editor, John Harris. The 75-meter water tank, with its perimeter gate at one end and then the ghost gate in the middle, was reused countless times during the shoot across the sequence. So the progression along the causeway was very much constructed in the edit and quite flexible. So there was considerable back and forth with editorial, as it was difficult to fully visualize the sequence and lock the edit until they had some worked up temporary visual effects versions. So as a result, a shot that was set up for visual effects as being a quarter of the way along the causeway might suddenly bounce to being halfway across with just a fairly straightforward change in the edit. But that could easily impact the visual effects pipe, as it could send us right back to the layout camera, the environment, the effects sims, and all of our CG rendering. Another important element of the nighttime causeway was the vast nebula skies. So very early in the project, Danny provided this image you see on the right as something that he wanted to work towards. The idea was that after 28 years without human pollution, without electrical light pollution, the skies of the UK would be much clearer and have a sort of slightly surreal quality. So we started with some high-resolution 32K photographic images, very kindly provided by the Kielder Observatory. This formed a solid base for the star's layout, but the resolution for the tighter frame shots wasn't quite good enough, and it didn't quite have the stylized magical quality that Danny was looking for. So we looked at the Hubble and James Webb Space Telescope references, including images of the Carina Nebula. We started to build in some of this color and variation with the addition of clouds and galaxies, and also added some auroras. So the finished sky domes were built into a new gizmo, covering all of the visible angles across the sequence. So here's a clip of our causeway sky dome asset. As you can see, you get a full 3D panoramic.
The Happy Eater sequence threw up some interesting creative briefs. From a story point, flammable gas has built up over the years inside a restaurant, seeping in from an adjoined petrol station. These fumes have formed a blanket of oily mist located roughly at shoulder and head height. We call this flammable gas miasma. This is not a real-world thing, so we struggled to find useful references. So we had to create something that was in between a volume and a liquid, but had the behavioural qualities of both. The FX team experimented with various simulation settings in order to find the right behaviour for the miasma. We showed these various iterations to Danny. Our approach to this sequence was to work up a hero shot that Danny was happy with, and once this was approved, we were able to roll it out across the entire sequence. The sequence was shot with SFX mist on set, but it could not be controlled to form a blanket, and it was all over the place in terms of continuity between shots. In the story, Spike and his mum are chased into the restaurant by the infected. They are then rescued by the soldier Eric, who ignites the miasma, killing the infected. Our lighting approach to this focused on readability of volumetric fumes and character interaction. The lighting team used FX cache attributes to test the colour, the scattering and the light response. They focused on the interaction between the light and the moving fume layers while ensuring disturbances in the miasma were visible at key heights. And they added light rays and interactive character shadows. Delivered a wide range of lighting passes which enabled flexible blending and integration for the compositing team. From a CG perspective, this was quite involved. The roto-anim was primarily for driving FX collisions, so as a holdout they lacked the finer details required. Characters were also rotoed, and Comp had to do a fair bit of bespoke integration. The FX sims also tended to lose colour information the more chop the miasma became. So, as I mentioned, lighting compensated for this by creating additional passes to allow Comp to bring back colour details. Roto-anim was used to drive the movement and turbulence of the miasma. However, between cuts, the FX team also had to maintain the movement of the miasma from the previous shot and into the next. In cases where we had miasma really close to the camera, we would upraise our FX caches so we could read the finer details.
So for the ignition scene, the infected looked like this. Some very brave stunt performers in fireproof wetsuits. So those masks are pretty grim, but they don't animate, obviously, and they look burnt before the fire has hit them, so they needed quite a lot of augmentation. So some were replaced entirely. For others, we prepped out the suit seams and replaced their faces only, adding patches of fire using 2D and FX elements. So to achieve the ignition in camera, we set up a layer of flammable cotton wool in chicken wire across the room at shoulder height. So this created the base layer for some of the fire shots. As you can see, we then had to prep out the chicken wire and rebuild the room behind. So we added the effects miasma and fire sims using Axiom and integrated this with the plate photography. So we could have bypassed the stunt doubles, the live fire, and created the scene entirely in CG, and in some ways that would have been a more controlled and arguably more straightforward pipeline. But one of the great things working with Danny is there's always a strong desire to capture what we can on set in camera. And we find that that brings a kind of visceral energy and unpredictability of the real world, which you can then mix with the control that we have in CG. And you can get, through that process, I think you can get some outstanding results.
Moving on to our creature work, we had a few creature builds for this show, which were flies, starlings, and deer. The deer was a story point to illustrate how nature can prosper without the threat of humans. We see a huge herd of deer pass by Jamie and Spike as they are exploring the mainland. This was a crowd set up in Houdini. We used a deer rig in Maya to create multiple animation clips. These animations were looped and blended. We also had variation in scale, shape and texture. The daytime setup had up to 2,700 deer agents, and the deer stampede was also used later on as a story point to explain why the chimney collapses in the farmhouse.
So here we've got some examples of the DMP work we created, showing nature reclaiming the landscape. So the brief here was to add weathering and foliage, but avoid distracting stylization and retain the structure of the original landscape that was abandoned by humans. So we always tried to ask, what's the story behind this for each piece of damage, and does it make sense in relation to the 28 days later backstory? So some shots used 3D geometry from the camera track to help procedurally apply a noise for a kind of global breakup across the plate. But most of the work on shots like this is not really procedural. It's quite bespoke and detail-oriented DMP work done by some very talented artists. So we also had a considerable amount of work on the train sequence. Here we see an infected give birth, and Spike and his mother are chased by an alpha called Samson. As with a lot of the environments, we needed to show how nature has started to reclaim the environment. We added additional foliage to the bridge, the locomotive, and the surrounding area. We also built and added additional CG carriages to extend the real onset train further along the tracks. We covered the carriages with ivy and added rust and weathering. We used speed tree for the additional foliage and rendered in Arnold via Solaris. For the tighter shots, we used DMP to up-res the texture and add additional wear and tear, and we can see some examples of that in the next video. So a little breakdown. So the train, along with the Bone Temple itself, also appears in the sequel, The Bone Temple, directed by Nia DaCosta, and again written by Alex Garland. So there were no iPhones in the Bone Temple, which was shot in a much more traditional way, predominantly using the Alexa 35 camera, and it might be considered more of an intimate character study of some of the key players who were introduced in 28 years later. So focusing on Dr. Kelson's relationship with Samson, the infected alpha, and Spike's involvement in the gang, the Jimmies. So it was a smaller film in terms of budget and overall shot count and the number of crew, but there were still some creative challenges to overcome. Here's a taster of some of our work from that installment.
Okay, well, thanks for listening and watching, and we hope you enjoyed our presentation. So we can't guarantee you'll be killing zombies, but Union is a great place to work. We have a really talented and welcoming team, and we work with some fantastic filmmakers, so please do reach out if you're interested in careers or working with us. Thank you very much.